Well, the polls were right. It was a close race. And if you look at who got more votes, you wouldn't correctly guess who won the night. It's a strong Liberal minority, even if the Conservative Party got more votes overall. Here to explore what happened and what's ahead in a country whose divisions will be back on full display in this Parliament. We welcome David Hurley, former chief campaign strategist for the Liberals under Paul Martin and Kathleen Wynne, now principal partner at the Gandalf Group and host of the quite wonderful and always profane Hurley Burley podcast. Melissa Lanceman is here. She's the head of Doug Ford's War Room in the last provincial election and a veteran of the Harper government. She's now Vice President, Public Affairs at Hill & Knowlton Strategies. Kiavash Najafi, former NDP strategist for both Tom Mulcair and Jack Layton. Abhijit Mane, Deputy Leader for the Green Party of Ontario. And happy to have Jane Tabor back in that chair. She spent 25 years covering Parliament Hill for the Ottawa Citizen, National Post, and Globe and Mail. She's now Vice President, Public Affairs at National Public Relations. It's so nice to see you again.
Thank you, Steve.
I have to say, you all look great for 3 hours sleep. Yeah, not bad at all. Let's bring a few maps up here and just show people what Canadians did last night. Sheldon, if you would, the following graphics. That's what the country looks like today. Very chunky, I have to say. Very regional, lots of cleavages on display right there. And flip that map over and let's see what happened in the province of Ontario. That's what Ontario did last night. And look in the northwest corner of that map. There's Kenora, which is blue provincially and federally. I can't ever remember when that happened again. They used to call Toronto Tory Toronto. Boy, when I was growing up, it was Tory Toronto. It sure is not anymore. Should we put some numbers up there, Sheldon? Let's see what our stats say. This was, well, that's what it looked like at dissolution. 177 Liberal seats and 95 Conservatives, and on we go. And let's flip it over and see what happened last night. And the results are, the Liberals are down, the Conservatives are up, the Bloc is way up, the NDP is way down, the Greens are up a little bit. There's that one independent, Jody Wilson-Raybould. She did win her seat in Vancouver-Granville, and the People's Party got shut out. As I set up this first question, let me also add that in the Greater Toronto Area, 53 ridings, the Liberals won 47 of 53. The Conservatives took 6, the NDP nothing. The Liberals got almost half the vote in the Greater Toronto Area. David, start us off here. How did the Liberals keep Fortress Ontario so strong in spite of blackface, brownface, SNC Lavalin, fewer sunny days, more cloudy days, etc.?
Well, largely because they are running against a party that refuses, in the Conservatives, that refuses to embrace modernity and refuses to really embrace what urban living is like in Canada. And so they have found themselves tremendously offside with the major urban centres all across Canada. And when you get into like the 905 region outside of Toronto, so that explains the downtown core of Toronto. What explains the 905 is that there's always a struggle between the Conservatives who own the countryside and the Liberals who own the downtown core to persuade the 905 that they're either more like them or more like us. And obviously in this campaign, partially probably because of the Ford experience, partially because of the kind of campaign that Mr. Scheer ran with, for instance, no emphasis on climate change, that a lot of those voters said, I actually feel more like an urban voter today than I feel like a rural voter today.
Melissa, the Liberals were vulnerable, but it didn't happen. Why not?
It didn't happen this time around. I'm not sure that that's not the case, frankly, next time around. For Mr. Scheer, this was going to be a two-election strategy. But look, the seats that the Tories picked up in Toronto, they are not the changing face of Ontario. So it's a deep inward look. It's a soul-searching exercise about whether this party represents a party that can grow or whether it looks a lot more like a Western Reform Party.
Kiavash, before the election campaign started, people were predicting the NDP would be utterly decimated. Yeah. That didn't happen, but they're not in great shape. How are you looking at your fortunes today?
Well, a lot of the results last night reminded me of 2004, the first outing for Jack Layton, with some major differences. One of them is that Jack never had the balance of power until Belinda Stronach crossed the floor to Paul Martin, and that gave Jack the ability to negotiate a change to the Martin budget in 2005 and canceled $4.6 billion of corporate tax cuts and reinvested into progressive priorities. The difference in this election, as far as I'm concerned, is that Jagmeet Singh is going in with, albeit humbled by the disappointing results and the lack of growth. But compared to where he was 40 days ago and the obituaries that everybody was writing for the NDP, I think he's saved the party. He has put some real proposals in front of Canadians.
Let me jump in with this, though.
Yeah.
2 elections ago, 58 Quebec New Democrats. Last night, one.
Yeah. Definitely, there was a shift in Quebec, and I heard Chantal Hébert say it that after 2015 and after Tom Mulcair, being fired by the NDP basically from the leadership position, nobody was going to save Quebec. But what Jagmeet has done is that he has changed the tone of the conversation. He has been changing hearts and minds. His numbers did grow in Quebec. It did not translate into seats. Unfortunately, a number of seats were lost by very small margins. But I think having Alexandre Boulris as a foothold in Rosemont Le Petit-Patrie.
He's the one surviving.
He's the
New
one
Democrat in
surviving.
Quebec.
He's the deputy leader, and he's a strong Quebec progressive. I think there is room for growth. Obviously, a disappointing result as far as Quebec was concerned.
Sure. 1 million votes for the Greens last night. More than 1 million votes, but only 3 seats. How are you regarding things today?
Well, like I was saying, we tripled our seat count from the last time.
And you have a 2/3 female-male caucus.
There you go. Yeah. And at the end of the day, we're now a party that's federally on both coasts, and that's reflected in how we succeeded provincially as well. It started in British Columbia, then it was. Then it was New Brunswick and PEI, and then we came to Upper Canada. So that's the strategy federally, and we'll get there.
As you look at the map of the country today,
Oh, I see great divisions. I mean, I see the government just governing from the Atlantic, Quebec and Ontario, and then a whole different thing happening out west. And I think we saw it happening last night with the speeches, with the speeches, the wrap up. Everybody's talking over everybody else, and we're supposed to think about cooperation because there's going to be a minority government. I'm not seeing that. Like right off the bat, there's no cooperation. Nobody's speaking to anybody. So I think it's going to be an interesting parliament.
As long as you mention that, I was going to save this for later, but let's put this up now. Sheldon, you got that picture of last night? You know, there is a protocol to these things that the smaller parties are supposed to speak first, and the Prime Minister is supposed to have unfettered access to the airwaves to make the final sort of, here's what happened last night. But there was a moment last night. Jagmeet Singh's speech went on very, very long. Andrew Scheer then started to speak, and 2 minutes into his speech, Justin Trudeau then was brought into the room, and he started to speak. That's not the way it's supposed to roll out. I'm not blaming anybody, because I don't know what the heck happened here, and Doug Ford did it to Kathleen Wynne a year and a half ago during the Ontario election campaign. But apropos, David, of what Jane just said, if the whole idea is to signal to Canadians that we're going to have to learn how to get along better in the next parliament, how well did they do at 1:30 in the morning last night?
Well, I think it was indicative of the kind of relationships they have. Obviously, there was no coordination. Obviously, people weren't. I mean, you would expect in that circumstance that the people who are working on tour and logistics would be corresponding with the other parties to try to coordinate this rollout. That's traditionally what happens. That seems not to have been happening last night. And obviously, Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau did not care that they were talking over top of each other, and they just thought they'd take a moment before it got too late to get out there. But it is an indication, I think, of the changes that are going to have to happen if a minority parliament is to work.
Yeah.
What did you infer from that when you saw it?
Well, I infer this, all three leaders came out and they gave a speech as if they all won the election, when in fact they all lost the election. Justin Trudeau returns as Prime Minister, albeit his wings clipped. Andrew Scheer does not get to form government. And Jagmeet Singh, well, he went down in sort of the half number of seats and certainly on a lower vote share. Like he did not. All of these parties did not manage expectations, and I think that's the story of last night.
Didn't manage expectations in as much as Mr. Scheer actually thought he was going to win last night?
I think that they're, running on a majority message and certainly broadcasting a much closer race. While it does galvanize your base, it is also clear that, maybe he didn't know that.
Jane, was that a mistake for Mr. Scheer in the dying days of the campaign to say, I'm this close to a majority government. Come on, give it to me, please.
Yeah, I know you're supposed to be bold and you're supposed to encourage your troops, as you were saying, Melissa, but I have to tell you, if it's not there, it's not there. So it's just basically you're just blowing smoke, and it doesn't look credible for a leader to do that, and then allows everybody to say, well, look, what was he talking about at the end of it? I don't think that's a great strategy. I think, Canadians aren't stupid, and they can see what's happening. Voters aren't dumb, and for that to be going on, I just thought, from a public relations viewpoint, there was not great public relations in a lot of the last week in terms of answering questions from Mr. Trudeau, from Mr. Scheer as well. And I just think, honesty really is the best policy. As hard as it may be, honestly, Canadians know when people aren't giving the straight good.
I think another thing that contributed to this, last-minute swing of Liberal New Democrat switchers swinging strongly toward the Liberals in the final days, especially in Ontario, I think it had to do with Andrew Scheer constantly talking about a majority government. He was scaring people, and he was feeding the Liberal message of, you got to vote for us to stop Andrew Scheer.
I've got a piece up on the TVO website today which explores the question. I'm not taking a position on it, but it explores the question of whether or not the results last night would have been any different had Doug Ford not been, as Premier Bob Rae described it, had not been kept in the witness protection program for the last 40 days, but in fact had been allowed out of his cage and permitted to campaign. I'd like to get your wisdom on that. David.
I think people who say that must be saying, well, the Conservative campaign was unsuccessful. What if they'd let a wild tiger run around the province? Would they have done better or worse? I mean, they made absolutely the right call. Doug Ford is a pure hard negative for them. The Liberals were defining Scheer as Ford. You didn't need an example of that out there on the hustings all the time. And it is from a campaign perspective, he's a completely unmanageable person to have if you've licensed him to go around and participate in the campaign. You have literally no idea what he's going to say, when he's going to say it, where he's going to say it. So it would be like surrendering your campaign to Mr. Ford. I would have, at the time, said that they made the right call, and in retrospect, I would still say that they made the right call, because as disappointing as the results in Ontario were, I bet 40 days of Doug Ford would have made them worse.
I'm going to make Melissa wait till the end and have what everybody else says first go on the record. Abhijit, what do you think?
I think absolutely I agree with David, because it was already an uncertain election, and when you put in more variables in, especially uncertain variables like Mr. Ford in there, it just mucks the whole thing up, and the Conservatives would have languished further from what they were already doing.
Jane, your view.
Well, probably the right call, but it's so unfortunate. I feel sorry for Doug Ford actually to be in this rec room for the entire election campaign, and he's out again today. But I guess making a speech in camera, we're hearing. So that's kind of interesting. But to unleash that kind of force on Ontario would probably have been a negative for the Conservatives. I want to say, too, that unfortunately, I don't think she ran a very good campaign in Ontario, and the loss of Lisa Raitt, I think, is a huge loss to your party, and I think to Parliament. She's a terrific MP, and I was sorry to see her go.
Kievash.
I think it was the right call not to have Doug Ford on the hustings, but it doesn't seem like Andrew Scheer had learned much from the Doug Ford success. There was no real narrative to the Andrew Scheer campaign, as far as I was receiving. There was a message of change at a time that people did not significantly want change in government, other than places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the kind of populism and anti-elite narrative that Doug Ford has excelled in, Andrew Scheer did not catch on to that at all.
Do you know whether there were, presumably there were conversations at Conservative Party headquarters about how to, or if to, use Doug Ford, and they clearly came down on the side of, we don't want anything to do with him.
Yeah.
In hindsight, was it the wrong call?
Look, any way that you look at this, Doug Ford won a resounding majority in Ontario, and he won it on the message of affordability. I'm working harder, I'm not getting ahead, I'm going to help you. That message didn't resonate in Ontario, or frankly, in a lot of other places for Andrew Scheer. And part of it was that he couldn't get that message out. Part of it that message wasn't as laser focused as Doug Ford was in Ontario. But you can't take away 76 seats in Ontario, which is almost akin to what the Liberals won last night in Ontario from Doug Ford. So, blaming him, putting him in the trunk of a car, I'm not sure.
Have you talked to him over the last 40 days?
I have not talked to him over. I have talked to him over the last 40 days.
What I have been told is that it has been absolutely killing him to have to keep his mouth shut for the last 40 days. He is one, I mean, particularly because the Liberals have hit him like a piñata, and he's wanted to respond to protect his own reputation as it is.
I've never met a politician who wants to be silenced. So I'm not sure that I would put Doug Ford or frankly anybody I've ever worked with in the category of somebody who doesn't want to say what they think about federal politics. But the statement that you saw from Doug Ford this morning was very different in tone. It was very conciliatory. Mm-hmm. It was knowing that the funding for many of the infrastructure projects, the transit projects that Doug Ford is leading in Ontario, lies in the hands of the Liberals right now, and he's certainly playing ball.
Jane, can I just get you on that? Mm-hmm. The Premier's office did release this morning a very conciliatory, very civilized statement saying, I guess what you'd call all the right things, congratulating Justin Trudeau on his victory, and we look forward to working with you and building subways and yada, yada, yada. What went into that tone of that message?
Does that speak to a change in the Chief of Staff? Maybe that they decided that the scorched earth strategy doesn't work under Dean French, and maybe this is a new strategy, and maybe they want to try to get along with Trudeau. I'm not sure how long that's going to work. But he had said, I saw some tweets this morning that Ford had said that he will move on from the whole carbon tax issue if the Liberals win.
He said that a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
He said, well, let the people decide it.
Yeah, so the people have decided. Do you think the people have decided? Yeah, I would say in Ontario. So Melissa's like,
I'm not sure that I'm not sure that a Liberal minority is a resounding win.
Did he say resounding win? I guess
Liberals.
We'll have to parse that.
It certainly sounded like that from
But if you're talking about climate, I really think this is an important area.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I think the most significant strategic decision that the Scheer campaign made to cost them this election was their decision not to even pretend to care about climate change. Their decision not to offer a fig leaf of a climate change plan, because Canadians don't really want to sacrifice standard of living to fight climate change. They don't want to pay a carbon tax to fight climate change, but they believe climate change is a serious threat that somebody needs to be fighting. And I think that at the end of the day, in an election in which people were having trouble deciding, the fact that at this zeitgeist moment that you had one of the parties that they were considering said, we don't care about this issue at all. Like, we really want you to understand, we're going to announce more funding for roads on the day of the climate march. Like, we want you to understand, we don't care about this issue.
And I think in the
905, that tilted the balance for a lot of voters.
Abhijit, is that to conclude that if anybody has any pretensions of forming government in the future in this country, you've got to have a serious position on climate change?
Absolutely. I mean, this election, and I've said it many times, was the climate change election, and it was a referendum on climate change and what your party's actions are on it. The Greens have been at it for decades, and the fact that we, have 1 million votes, and those votes are also restricted because it's a first-past-the-post system, so a lot of people are voting strategically. So the fact that if we had proportional representation, we would have a much more representative parliament, which would ensure that climate action is even more effective.
Can I pick up on that? Kievash, there was criticism back in the day of Jack Layton when he did have the balance of power in Parliament. There was criticism that he did not use that position to say to the Liberals who were in power at the time, if we don't get proportional representation, we're pulling the plug on you guys right now. Should Jagmeet Singh say that to Justin Trudeau? This is at the top of my list. Some form of parliamentary reform has got to happen, and if we don't get it, we're pulling the plug on you guys right away.
I don't know, top of the list, and that kind of, Jane was talking about collaboration and conciliation, and Melissa mentioned about the fact that nobody really won last night. Nobody really has the moral authority to say that I'll pull the trigger and have another election if you don't dance with me. So I think Jagmeet Singh is going to enter this parliament with the balance of power, and hopefully the Liberals have also been somewhat receiving the message that they need to dance with other parties. And I think my hope is that that electoral reform will come back on the agenda, and hopefully some of the Liberals who ran initially in 2015 on electoral reform look at the numbers last night and they think to themselves, for the good of the country, is it okay that the Green Party with the same number of votes has 3 seats and Bloc Québécois has 33? Is it okay that with twice the number of votes, Jagmeet Singh has half the caucus of Denis Blanchet.
But this prime minister has already weighed in on that and come to the conclusion that, yes, it's okay.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
our
I mean,
system.
This prime minister has weighed on both sides of that issue, and the math is a bit different.
Well,
so
I don't
maybe-
think he's ever weighed in favor of proportional representation. He's weighed in
didn't
favor of
close the
parliamentary
door.
reform. And I think that he was talking about ranked ballots, not about
I
proportional
think he-
representation.
I suspect that not very many people are going to be talking about
Exactly.
electoral reform when the Tories actually won the biggest number of votes, including Tories. I will never advocate for for the kind of thing that Jagmeet Singh is pushing for in terms of the way that we elect our members. But this wasn't necessarily, and to go back to the climate change conversation, this wasn't a referendum on climate change. It was absolutely a referendum on the Prime Minister, and it's going to put him in a position where it's even more difficult for him to operate in the way that he usually does. All of the skills that he has shown us over the 4 years are not the same skills that you need to govern a minority government. And having people chomping at the bit to make that government fall is going to be very difficult for Justin Trudeau.
Let me pick up on that. David, if you were sitting down with the prime minister tomorrow and you were pointing out the obvious math to him, that if you take his seats and you add the New Democrat seats, you've got a workable majority of 10, 11, we'll see what happens if recounts, but basically it's comfortable. How do you make that work? What do you say to him? What do you advise?
Well, you've got to get the lines of communication open right away. And I don't think, frankly, that with one enormous caveat that this is very difficult. I think there's a tremendous amount of commonality between the NDP platform and the Liberal platform. There's lots of space for them to find room to put together a governing agenda. I don't expect that to be terribly difficult, with one exception. How does the pipeline get built? How?
Through Jagmeet Singh's riding.
Right. How does the Trans Mountain Pipeline get built? And if it doesn't get built because there's a Liberal NDP Green coalition, just watch the prairies literally go thermonuclear.
more than now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think one of the things that does injustice to our electoral map is the overrepresentation of the regional differences when you look at the map of Canada versus the actual reality. I mean, Alberta did vote 70% Conservative last night, but it didn't vote 99% Conservative, one seat going NDP. The Liberals still had a presence there and they got 0 seats. The Greens had a presence and they got no seats. Similarly with Saskatchewan. And I think part of the problem that we have in this country is that it is dangerous that the new cabinet is not going to have any voices from Edmonton or Calgary or Alberta or even Saskatchewan. At
Or
the
even
table.
Saskatchewan. This is what you have to get used to when you're from Saskatchewan. No voices from Alberta or even Saskatchewan.
That did come out a little pejoratively, I have to say.
70% Conservative.
Let me, I want to set up Jane with this here. Here's John Edmondson writing in the Globe and Mail saying, election campaigns sometimes open our eyes to realities we'd rather not see. The current campaign has revealed a Canada fractured along lines of geography and generations. Quebecers reject English Canada's multicultural consensus. The West is angry and estranged from the centre, and younger, more progressive voters resent the baby boomers' entitlements. If you're the Prime Minister sitting down today trying to cobble together a workable majority in the House of Commons with all of that as a foundation of where we're at today, where do you start?
Well, I think you start, as David said, you start talking to people. I covered, I think, three minority governments, Paul Martin, two Harper minority governments, and they worked. I mean, stuff gets done, budgets get passed, and it's all because people are talking to one another and figuring things out. So you do have to have those MPs who like each other. Dominic LeBlanc was a guy that really could talk to all parties, and they would, and he would be deployed in certain situations. And I mean, David, you were helping out Paul Martin at the time. You know exactly how to work a minority. You guys had people crossing floors. I mean, Glinda Stronach crossed the floor to save a Paul Martin budget.
I don't know that we knew exactly how to do anything, given how it ended.
Well, you did it. It happened. You did it. You governed for a while. I mean, you have to talk, and you have to have the will. I don't don't think Canadians want to go to the polls again. I really don't. And I think that's the calculation that all the parties have to make. That in 18 months maybe, or 2 years maybe, but not right away.
Not to mention, I think minority governments are inherently a good thing. Some of our greatest achievements as Canadians have been under a minority government, mostly the Pearson government, whether that's healthcare, whether that's our flag, whether that's education assistance, right? So I think there's something inherently good about a minority government, which means that not one party has 100% of the power, and you have to negotiate and you have to work with everyone so that all facets of Canadians are represented.
There is one, as my former colleague Tim Murphy, Paul Martin's former chief of staff, pointed out, Liberal NDP governments tend to be expensive.
I think Andrew Scheer is trying to point that out as well during the campaign.
Well, it's a good thing there's some Greens in there to keep you fiscally responsible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Expensive, but good for people.
Melissa's got the floor.
You have a country that is extremely divided after yesterday. You have the rise of the Bloc, you have Western alienation, you have two premiers in François Legault and Premier Jason Kenney that just got a whole lot stronger in terms of their position in the Federation. And then you have a Prime Minister, frankly, who has spent the last 4 years being an international rock star, who now has to look entirely inward to deal making, to caucus management, to a weaker Prime Minister's office. That's going to be very difficult. And he's not Paul Martin, and he's not Stephen Harper.
That's the map of the country now. I did Danielle Smith's radio show last week. She's the former opposition leader in the province of Alberta. You know, there were Alberta MPs last night who won their seats with 70% of the votes. And they cannot, I mean, Danielle Smith was telling me this, they cannot understand how Central Canada is still demonstrating so much fealty to the Liberal Party. The anger out west is absolutely palpable right now. And I'm not sure how that map helps us resolve. So David, tell me this. Many options going forward right now for the Prime Minister. Does he try to seek bill by bill by bill by bill approval from the NDP? Does he try to work some kind of formal accord, as happened in the province of Ontario in 1985, where the two leaders signed something? Does he, I don't think he's going to offer cabinet seats to the NDP, obviously, so no formal coalition, but sort of paint us a picture of the map forward.
I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think that the Liberal position is strong enough and its relative position to the NDP is strong enough that it doesn't need to offer them very much to participate. I think it does need to cooperate with them on policy and issues, but the other reason I think case-by-case is because that's presumably the only way the pipeline can get built, is if it starts off with the Conservatives and the Liberals getting whatever approvals that pipeline needs to get done.
And what do you do? I'm not going to say, you're just from Saskatchewan, so who cares? I'm going to say you're from Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan just lost its one Liberal seat at the cabinet table, a guy who'd first been there since 1974. Your mentor, Ralph Goodale. How do you represent a part of the country when you have zero representation? That's Saskatchewan, that's Alberta.
Well, it has to really be a personal preoccupation of the Prime Minister now. There is no substitute for that. People are talking about potentially putting Ralph into the Senate and making him a minister or doing that with somebody from Alberta. We did that under Mr. Trudeau Sr. in the 1980s. It didn't work. Those people have no legitimacy. Ralph would go immediately from being the most respected person in Regina to the least respected person in Regina if that were to happen. So that doesn't work. The Prime Minister has to take it seriously, though. And I don't mean that about this Prime Minister. I mean any Prime Minister in this circumstance, because we're talking to an Ontario audience, and I'm from Saskatchewan, I want to say that if you were living out in those two provinces and you're a rational actor and you say, okay, so the core industry that has sustained us for decades is going to have to be wound down. I understand that over time, is going to have to be wound down, right? Who should be making those decisions about how that happens? Should it be a bunch of Liberals and New Democrats elected in Eastern Canada? Or should we be making these decisions, the fundamental decisions about the future of our province? I'm saying these are rational questions to ask if you live in that region, and the rest of Canada better have some answers for it other than just suck it up, Buttercup.
Yeah, well, this is how we saw the rise of the Reform Party. I mean, this is exactly what Preston Manning was doing. The West wants in. And I remember talking to Manning after the Harper majority. He was worried that the East was now being alienated, that the East wasn't in because the West was so strong under the Harper government. And I think that the West I think you would agree, felt very empowered with Harper, and now they haven't over the last 4 years. And so we're seeing this. And I was with the Canadian manufacturers and exporters last week, and they were so upset about steel makers and steel producers, manufacturers, very upset about this election campaign that nobody was really talking about the economy. There was really no great idea, big thinking about what's going to be happening over the next 4 years. And that was a mess, I think, for all of the parties. It was all sort of incremental stuff, an extremely nasty campaign.
We should take just a moment here and make reference to the People's Party of Canada, which, Mr. Bernier, Maxime Bernier, lost his own seat, the seat his father held before him. That's a quarter century of representation in the Beauce in Quebec. That is now done with the Bernier name. The People's Party got in Etobicoke North, which was their big star candidate, Renata Ford, the current Premier of Ontario's former sister-in-law, 2.8% of the vote.
And she was the reason he was in the debate.
Right.
Her likelihood of winning that riding was the reason why the consortium put her in the debate. And they got what percent of the vote in that riding?
2.8 in Etobicoke North.
Excellent decision to have him in the debate.
Yeah, what a
Excellent
terrible
decision.
I'm
decision.
sensing you're being facetious.
I
with that
am
comment.
hugely being
And
facetious.
giving the first 15 minutes of that debate
Yeah.
to that guy who had zero legitimacy and zero reason to be on that
A
stage.
lot of credit for this goes to Andrew Scheer for holding a Conservative Party together where there was a fracture in it, and it could have gone badly. The only person who ruined Maxime Bernier's political career is Maxime Bernier, and it was nobody else.
Do those voters, I mean, he obviously got some votes last night, not very many, but he got some. Do those voters, are they homeless now?
Look, I think that there's a home for them, in a different place. I don't know exactly who those voters are or why they voted for him, but perhaps we can take the best parts, and there aren't very many good parts about Maxime Bernier's platform, and welcome those voters. Not the bigoted parts, not the racist parts. And I think David's right. The conversation about having somebody like that in a debate should be a conversation we should never have again.
Do you
Melissa,
see it?
don't you suspect that a lot of those people weren't previous voters?
I'm not sure.
There's an assumption that they're previous Conservative voters, and I think a lot of them are just not previous voters.
We won't know that until sort of we do a deep dive in the riding. In the case of the Beauce, Maxime Bernier was the Prince of the Beauce. His father was the King of the Beauce. So to see that go Conservative, I think the Conservatives should be pretty happy about that, and I think Canadians should just be happy about not seeing Maxime Bernier take up more airtime than he's worth in Parliament.
Jane, let's just remind ourselves, though, this was a guy who, when the Conservatives were having their leadership convention, led on 12 out of 13 ballots or 13 out of 14 ballots, whatever it was, and ended up losing by 1 point.
Yeah.
So he's a player. He's been a player.
Because he has a point of view. And I think when people in those leadership contests have a real point of view like that, that they can get people behind them.
But is his project done now?
Well, I don't know, supply management was his project. I'm not sure what it is anymore because he changed during the election campaign, and he became this a person that I
Mean tweets became his.
Yeah, I didn't
new thing.
recognize. He wasn't that guy in Ottawa. Like, I don't think he was like
Because
that
it
in
wasn't
Ottawa.
him. During the leadership,
So-
it is an entirely different Maxime Bernier. I'm somebody who supported those ideas during leadership, and not once did he speak about immigration. Not once did he speak about the bigoted things that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
We should talk. Enough about the People's Party. We should talk. There was one unambiguous winner last night. It wasn't the Liberals, it wasn't the Conservatives, it wasn't the New Democrats, it wasn't the Greens, it wasn't the People's Party. It was the Bloc Québécois. They are back in Quebec in a very real way. I want to know what we're supposed to make out of that. David.
I think that everybody is coming around to the same conclusion on this, which is that if it is not a resurgence of separatism, but it is most definitely a resurgence of nationalism. And I think what I saw happening in the province of Quebec was that, in the whole country, the campaign really wasn't about anything. It didn't have a galvanizing idea or choice. And so into that vacuum moves other things. And in Quebec, into that vacuum moved Bill 21. And I think that the francophone voters of Quebec rallied around the Bloc Québécois to say to the rest of Canada, mind your own business, right? Stay out of this. This is our call. And so that's what the election became about in Quebec. That's what I think the Bloc represent. I don't mean to say narrowly Bill 21. I mean the whole CAQ agenda, the more autonomous Quebec, within Canada.
But also a repudiation of Trudeau. Like I know a lot of people in Quebec who used to vote, who would have voted Liberal, decided to go Bloc this time. They felt that it wasn't they knew the Bloc wouldn't form the government. Nice to have a progressive wing in Parliament, and so they voted that way because they were just so disillusioned with Trudeau. He became a little ridiculous during the campaign.
Mind you, only lost 5 seats in Quebec last night.
Yeah, I know, but still, just to see the Bloc rise like that, that reminded me of with Bouchard, when Bouchard was the opposition leader in 1993. I mean, we're going to see that again. That Bloc caucus in '93. Really sophisticated and very professional. I gather this one's a little different. It's kind of like the NDP caucus from Jack Layton days.
I mean, that NDP caucus from Jack Layton days also had a lot of stars in it. I mean, we focused on some of the... I mean, some of them did quite well. But what's strange about it is that, we had gotten used to the Bouchard and Duceppe Bloc parties that were basically representing Francophone progressives. This is a different caucus, and I think it'll be interesting to see because I think you're going to have progressives coming from different parts of the province, but then you've got the more CAQ agenda, and people who were motivated mostly by their concerns around Bill 21, their rejection of Jagmeet Singh's turban and expression. So I think that's going to be an interesting caucus for Monsieur Blanchet to manage. And as Melissa said, we have to look at the numbers and see where they are. I don't know what the generational breakdown is on that, because as David said, there is a return of nationalism. But one thing that we experienced in 2011 was that a new generation of Québécois seemed to be very confident about their existence as Québécois, and they believed themselves to be citizens of the world. And they wanted to be part of a progressive coalition to build a government. They went behind Jack Layton. He couldn't close the deal in Ontario. They threw their support behind Justin Trudeau. He did close the deal, and there was a progressive government, but then that progressive government did not live to the expectations of the progressive voters. And now there's been a bit of a rejection. So I don't know what is this new bloc and what is the longevity
facet
of it.
Also is the environmental aspect of it, because I think the environmental vote went to the bloc because they weren't fans of Mr. Trudeau. They weren't fans of Mr. Scheer because of the Energy East corridor.
And they were adamant, no pipelines,
exactly.
no oil through Quebec.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they didn't like the NDP for other reasons. So it was either the Greens or the Bloc, and again, the strategic vote goes to the Bloc.
There was actually a lovely moment on French television last night. Gilles Duceppe, the former leader of the Bloc Québécois, his son won a seat in Quebec. And there was a moment when father and son were on camera together, son from Victoria's campaign headquarters, father from the set, and they just said, I love you, je t'aime, je t'aime, je t'aime. I love you, Dad, I love you, son, congratulations. It was a lovely moment, if not for the fact that they want to break up the country.
Exactly.
But it was but it was a lovely moment.
That's right, yes.
Let's go to this,
Gotta
okay?
get that kid in a hairnet.
I get the reference. Sheldon, let's do bottom of page 8. We'll read this Paul Wells excerpt from Maclean's magazine. Here's what Paul Wells had to write. "They're all bums" is the worst kind of pundit cliche. It's never entirely true. It glosses over the real challenges of governing. It's a cheap way to seem hard-bitten and world-weary. It's a stance I resist. But some election campaigns are just no good. After a few elections in which the stakes felt real, Jack Layton's orange wave and the solitary Harper majority of 2011, and the hope and hard work rise of Trudeau in 2015, this one seems deflated. We vote because we have to. We're pretty sure that we'll vote again soon, and that much of the business that got ignored or caricatured this time around will impose itself with altogether more urgency next time. You walk into the voting booth with a feeling of resignation.
Yes.
You say yes.
I totally agree with Paul, and I'm wondering if the 4 years, the set election date, is a good thing now. Because there was no reason for having an election this time around. I talked about that before. No big ideas, nothing that it wasn't a change.
He called it the Seinfeld election.
Yeah,
David Hurley did.
Oh,
about nothing.
Well, there you go. It wasn't about anything, and as you said, filling the vacuum then is all this nasty, backbiting, tweeting kind of stuff that was happening. I mean, it was fascinating to watch and read, but nothing happened.
You voted yesterday?
I actually voted in the advance polls.
You voted in the advance polls?
I have never voted on an election day, believe it or not. I don't know what everybody's talking about.
Did you feel good about voting?
Yeah, I did feel good about the voting. Look, I think the narrative of this was a nasty campaign, or all of them are bums and throw them out. Look, I think we do have to go back to the drawing board and give people something that they want. But there was a ton of policy in this campaign. It just wasn't talked about. I think the media drove a narrative of a nasty campaign with any number of issues that I can tell you about, be it blackface, be it insurance agent, but there were reason for people to vote. And today we have a very divided country where going forward is difficult for any leader. We have alienation in the West. We have the rise of the bloc. Those are the storylines that I think we need to unpack over the next couple months, and what that means for industry and for Canadians writ large.
David, did you vote with as much joy this time as I suspect you did 4 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely.
You did?
I did. I was no question in my mind about what kind of government the country needs to have. No question in my mind about what the stakes were if Mr. Scheer were to become the Prime Minister. So no, I didn't have any qualms about it. But that doesn't mean that I think that it was a campaign. To say, when I said it was the Seinfeld election, that doesn't mean that there's nothing at stake in the election. That doesn't mean there aren't important differences. What I was saying is that in the public, it didn't gel around anything.
What was the big idea? You talk about a lot of policy. What was it?
I will say that ultimately a big idea was, are you going to do something about climate, or are you not going to do something about climate? That was very much on the ballot, right, as a big choice. Conservatives gave that choice to the country, and I think that was one. Your point, though, is very right about the economy and the lack of discussion there is about the economy.
That's what I'm used to in elections. It usually goes to jobs, right?
And when I watch the American Democrats debate, and even when I watch Mr. Trump, there is a discussion in the States about the root causes of these economic problems that is not happening in Canada at all. There's a very vigorous discussion in the Democratic primary about the nature of how capitalism is working and how it's distributing results and what needs to change in that regard. Nobody touches that up here.
I have only enough time left to thank all of you for coming in, bleary-eyed though we all are, after very little sleep last night. And to remind everybody that Justin Trudeau went to a Grey Cup game when he was 4 years old, and the guy sitting beside him was a guy who happened to have run minority parliaments in the province of Ontario for 6 straight years and knows how it's done. So the Prime Minister might want to think about calling 90-year-old Bill Davis and seeing how it's done. That's just a thought. Thanks,
Maybe
everybody.
We can watch the Grey Cup together.
That would be fun. Thanks for coming into TVO tonight, everybody. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.